You have 80 million people. You have an armed elite of just 0.2%. How do you hold an entire nation hostage? For decades, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has maintained this impossible equation of control. Now, the crown passes to the leader's son, a hereditary dynasty. The regime didn't secure its future, it severed its own tightrope. Welcome to the Visible Hand. Today, we calculate the exact mathematical breaking point of this 0.2% regime. If you're watching this months or years from now, the comment section below is our ledger. Let's see if the math holds up. We cannot audit this 0.2% equation without a baseline. We need to know the true market price of absolute control. The answer lies in the gold standard of dictatorship, North Korea. Its machinery is worlds apart from Tehran, but the logic is identical. It proves that even with internet blackouts and daily brainwashing, absolute subjugation requires a 5% enforcement class. That translates to 1 enforcer for every 20 citizens. A strict, unbreakable 1:20 ratio. But to make this math work, we must isolate the correct variable, the privileged enforcer class. For a regime in survival mode, the only military force that counts is the one whose absolute loyalty is secured through massive wealth disparity. In North Korea, the military apparatus represents 5% of the population and 100% of the privileged class. An average worker makes $1 to $3 a month. The military gets everything else: food, fuel, absolute priority. Every resource is funneled to that 5%. Even a low-ranking soldier lives hundreds of times better than that of the publics. But here is the catch. Maintaining a 5% suppression force is economically impossible for a closed society. North Korea cannot fund its own survival. It only exists today because a foreign superpower pays the bills, with China accounting for over 95% of its economic lifeline. North Korea is a sponsored dictatorship. Now, apply this to Iran. The model breaks. 80 million people, no global benefactor. China buys the oil and Russia provides the tech. But in a nation of 80 million, that's a drop in the bucket. Nobody in the world can afford to bankroll a state of this scale. To stay in power, Tehran must fund its own violence. And when a regime pays out of its own pocket, it only funds absolute loyalty. The regular army remains a leftover relic of the ousted Shah. The clerics never trusted them, so they never paid them. They simply didn't make the cut. At $200 a month, a regular soldier is just another struggling citizen driving a taxi after work. They are not the enforcers. By cutting them out, Tehran abandons the North Korean model entirely. Instead of funding a 5% suppression force, they placed all their bets on the IRGC, operating on a razor-thin margin of just 0.2%. What breaks the North Korean equation? Geological luck. Oil. With enough oil, the cheapest form of control isn't violence, it's bribery. The deal across the Gulf is identical. 0 taxes and guaranteed jobs in exchange for absolute political surrender. It's not a government, it's a subscription to stability. Saudi Arabia is the ultimate test case. Unlike the boutique wealth of Qatar or the UAE, Saudi scales the bribe to 30 million people. Backed by $1 trillion wealth fund, they have perfected the math of buying peace. Stability isn't a policy, it's a purchase. Tehran's model wasn't an accident, it was born from paranoia. In 1979, fearing a military coup, the clerics engineered a parallel army loyal only to themselves, the IRGC. Then came the brutal 8-year war with Iraq, which mutated this ideological militia into a massive, heavily armed monster. When the war ended, the regime faced a crisis. Why bankrupt the treasury trying to copy the Gulf states and buy the silence of 80 million citizens? Instead, they made a different transaction. They bypassed the public entirely and subcontracted the oppression to this new military monster. But loyalty has a price tag. To secure the IRGC, the regime let them devour the host. They didn't just build a military, they built a state-sponsored cartel. Through tax-exempt foundations and engineering conglomerates, they hollowed out the state. The cartel monopolized the infrastructure, telecommunications, and a multi-billion-dollar black market. Today, they monopolize 40 to 60% of the Iranian economy. The regime gives this 0.2% a blank check to extract whatever they want. In return, the IRGC guarantees the silence of everyone else. But when the last trickle of oil wealth dries up and inflation spirals, the silence shatters. When hundreds of thousands of Iranians pour into the streets, the regime faces a mathematical crisis. Even if Tehran suddenly wanted to buy peace, like the Gulf states, it is too late. The IRGC's monopoly has already bled the host dry. The billions needed for a universal bribe simply don't exist. What the regime does next proves the ultimate axiom of autocracy. National prosperity is optional. Regime survival is mandatory. It settles into a permanent state of war against its own people. Violence is no longer an emergency measure. It is their only remaining policy. The IRGC clears the streets, resetting the clock for whoever sits on the throne. But without North Korea's foreign lifeline, ruling entirely through a Praetorian Guard follows a very specific trajectory. A nation engineered strictly to feed its military has a historical precedent. It's called Sparta. Hollywood myth remembers Spartans as warriors, but the reality was a parasitic economy. They treated their own homeland like a conquered territory. Spartan citizens were an occupying minority. They were outnumbered by their own slaves, the Helots, by at least 7 to 1. And in later years, 20 to 1. This elite produced zero economic value. By law, Spartan citizens were forbidden from farming, trading, or any manual labor. They were a full-time war machine, tasked with defending the state and securing the wealth produced by the Helots. No cash to buy loyalty. No sacred narrative to bridge the divide. Their entire existence hung on a terrifying structural vulnerability. If the Helots stopped working, the invincible Spartans wouldn't fall in battle. They would starve to death. To manage this demographic nightmare, Sparta relied on institutionalized terror. Every year, the state officially declared war on its own slave population. Extermination was bad business. The regime needed the labor. So they practiced a calculated culling. The secret police would target the thinkers, the leaders, and the alphas, execute the sharpest sheep, and the rest of the flock stays in line. But ruling entirely by pure violence breeds a permanent, systemic paranoia. Even with a suppression ratio of 14%, nearly 70 times higher than Iran's 0.2, the Spartans lived in a prison of their own making. They slept with spears next to their beds. They weren't just warriors, they were a hostile, occupying force, trapped in the very homes they claimed to own. The lesson of Sparta is a law of physics. Pure violence is unsustainable. Survival requires a second pillar, legitimacy. Regimes buy it with different currencies: economic performance, theological capital, direct subsidies, or the illusion of national greatness. When the money dries up, the fail-safe is always the gun. But Sparta proves that bullets have a mathematical limit. You cannot shoot everyone. Controlling 80 million people with a 0.2% elite is a mathematical miracle that dwarfs both Sparta and North Korea. For decades, the regime kept this broken machine running on two distinct fuels. Fuel number one, geopolitical branding. They didn't just preach, they built the axis of resistance. By financing a proxy network from Iraq down to Yemen, the regime branded itself as the ultimate counterweight to Western hegemony. They weaponized regional grievances to buy legitimacy. Fuel number two, petrodollars. The IRGC always took the lion's share of the oil wealth, but the sheer volume of that money meant something trickled down, just enough to keep the broken system lubricated. But today, the oil cake is shrinking under crippling sanctions, while the streets are filling with unprecedented anger. The dictator is now facing a physical limit. Let's do the math. Historically, one elite IRGC member might be able to terrorize 400 passive citizens. But when 400 people rise up at the exact same time, the machine gun loses its math. To survive, the regime desperately needs to expand its 0.2% enforcement class. But here is the financial brick wall. An average core IRGC member enjoys a lifestyle and income roughly 10 times that of an ordinary Iranian worker. Let's say the new supreme leader wants to double the size of this elite force. He wants to bring the ratio down. Instead of one guard for every 400 citizens, he needs one for every 200. But here is the problem. Doing that means doubling an already astronomical security budget. To reach North Korea's 5% suppression ratio, the cost would multiply by 20. It is financially impossible. The IRGC has already swallowed half of the nation's wealth. Even if they drained the entire country dry, they couldn't afford it. When a regime can no longer afford its Spartan elite, only one option remains: buying cheap mercenaries. Enter the Basij militia. The regime outsourced the bloodshed to the underclass. They recruited millions of poorly paid enforcers, compensating them not with oligarch salaries, but with university quotas, utility discounts, and meager wages. But relying on these cheap, outsourced mercenaries creates a fatal vulnerability. You get what you pay for. The supreme leader likes to believe these outsourced enforcers are blindly loyal. Internal data says otherwise. In 2022, hackers leaked classified IRGC bulletins, later verified by ISW intelligence. They revealed a dictator's worst nightmare. The Basij militia was already breaking rank. During recent nationwide protests, these underpaid enforcers suffered from extreme fatigue, low morale, and outright insubordination. When the paychecks are thin, cheap mercenaries hesitate to shoot their own neighbors. So, with the treasury running dry and the mercenaries hesitating, what kept this fragile system from collapsing entirely? They relied on a backup generator, the ideological illusion. For 40 years, the regime told its enforcers that they were not fighting for a corrupt mafia, but for a righteous Islamic republic. The entire foundation of the 1979 revolution was built on one defining achievement: overthrowing the corrupt, Western-backed hereditary monarchy of the Pahlavi dynasty. We have no kings here. We have no inherited thrones. That was their ultimate moral high ground. It is exactly why the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, fiercely opposed naming his own son as his successor while he was alive. He knew that the moment a son inherits the throne, the regime's moral camouflage vaporizes. But today, the unthinkable has happened. Forced into a corner, the elite has crowned the son, Mujtaba Khamenei, as the new supreme leader. In doing so, they have become the exact monster they overthrew. The supreme leader is no longer a spiritual guide. He is just another corrupt king. The revolution is dead. The ideological illusion is completely shattered. And this brings us to the final, inescapable math problem. Strip away the petrodollars. Strip away the ideological illusion. All that's left is raw, naked violence. But ruling by force alone requires North Korea's numbers, a 5% well-fed, privileged army. Iran has 0.2%. Tehran is trying to solve a 5% suppression problem with a 0.2% force. The math doesn't lie. This brings us back to the expiration date. When a regime is surrounded by 80 million people who are no longer afraid, it becomes a powder keg. Whether the shockwave comes from the outside or from within, all it takes is a spark. One random tragedy, one unexpected wave of public outrage. And when the divine illusion shatters, when the supreme leader's son inherits the throne like a corrupt king, it all comes down to a cold, mathematical question. Will these outsourced, underpaid helots really die to protect the offshore bank accounts of their Spartan masters? That concludes the strategy session. To keep your seat at the table for the next breakdown, look down and make that subscribe button grey. Meeting adjourned.